And now for the hard stuff.
Okay.
Everything else was just easy as pie. No pun intended. I guess it's been about 20 years I've been thinking about this problem, and when I met Murray, we were at an undiagnosed event, which we'll talk about tomorrow. He was the evening speaker. He gave a very nice talk about complexity mathematics and the Lorenz Chapter and so on. And when he was done, I saw my opportunity. So when question time came, I raised my hand and I asked him, I said, Murray, do you think that all this stuff you just showed to us could be the result of two things, flows and resistance? And he said, absolutely. He didn't say maybe, he didn't say let's talk. He just said absolutely, which is why he's here right now. And then he convinced me that I was wrong. So it got better. And Brad and I talked about this and some other folks, Mike Riddle, so I had made a horrible mistake. And it wasn't resistance. Resistance is a subset of a larger class of things, which in mathematics it's called coupling. But for human consumption, I think we're going to call it interactions. So that's why we're talking about flow and interactions. And the reason that we're here today, now, is because if this conceit that flow and interactions is actually what I've been proposing to you this week, it ought to show up in mathematics. And I've been looking at complexity mathematics somewhat puzzledly for a long, long time, trying to understand what the heck is this about. Not how does it work, which is also interesting, but why does it work? Mm-hmm. It's like saying everything about the B except Y. So everything about pattern recognition except Y. And I'm going to start with Murray by asking about the applications and the representations in nature, the power of complexity math. Why do we care about complexity mathematics?
Okay. Sure. Do we have the clicker?
Clicker.
We have visuals.
We have visuals, but we have no clicker.
Yeah. So the deal was, this is a real challenge for me because Mark says we have to give a presentation in 15 minutes on the applications of dynamical systems and flows and everything, and you can't have any words on your charts. So we'll see how we do. But to answer your question, flow is really, as several people have said today, it's about how things change in time. Okay, and people have been studying this for millennia, right? It goes back to Zeno and Galileo and Laplace and all the way up to Mandelbrot, right? And Wolfram and to this day. And what's interesting is we've been studying, and coupling is things change. So how do you describe how things change in time? You have to know the state they're in now and the law and what governs their change. So we have laws of motion and we have the current state. And if the current state of how things change depends on the state of other things, that's the coupling. Mm-hmm. And literally everything. So can we go?
So things that depend on each other or on other things.
Right.
Things where there are dependencies.
Right. So so we've had a whole history, and there's been a paradigm shift in that this conference really is a reflection of in the way we think about this. So very early days, people thought things changed because that's what's God's will, or the gods' wills to change things, and gods were fighting it out. Well, and then we had the Enlightenment, and now we had the clockwork universe, where if you understood the state of things precisely and the laws of motion precisely, we could predict the future with complete precision. And what we've learned over the last 60 years is that just doesn't happen. And let me talk, so we don't have the clockwork universe. So what do we have? And the whole point of this is that it really matters. So these maths really matter for the kind of problems we're all talking about. So what I'm hoping to do today is just give you a brief introduction, overview of what that sort of looks like. So again, planetary motion. By the way, I don't know if you know this, it's an unsolved problem whether the solar system is stable.
Okay.
And it's been
important.
It's important, but it's probably not as practical as some of the other problems.
Right.
Yeah. But weather, market dynamics, all the stuff that Dr. Janeway talked about last night with the interaction of the market with the financials, with people's attitudes, all these are coupled dynamic systems. Ecologies are coupled dynamic systems.
So all these are areas in which complexity mathematics has power.
Yeah, exactly. And the complexity mathematics has all been about understanding how to describe the way these systems operate.
Right.
Okay, and how much can we really predict about them?
Right.
Okay, so, and again, so the conceit that we had during the clockwork universe phase was that we could actually measure things to enough precision that we could actually
Predict everything.
predict everything. And what we learned actually since the example of Lorenz and others, that there's lots of systems where a very small change in the current state, even down to the quantum levels, actually can have huge effects in the outcomes. So these are some examples we're going to talk about. So we actually have two ways of describing systems. One is an agent-based system, and that's what we have here on the left. This is the famous Conway's game of life. I'm going to ask you, how many people have heard of Conway's game of life? Good. For those who haven't, go on the web. What it is, it's a set of very simple rules that governs how each node, you look at where each node is, and you look at how many neighbors it has, and this determines whether this node is going to live or die. Okay, and so if it has 3 neighbors, it'll live. If there's 3 neighbors and there's no node there, they'll give birth. It's a really weird very weird kind of world. And you can see that this looks very predictable, but I'm going to show you some examples. I have an example which I won't show you here, where if I change the grid by just one measurement, everything changes over time. And so even these systems, if we don't have completely precise measurements, we really can't predict their outcomes. What we have on the right are examples of continuous flows, and these are how we describe these with mathematics of differential equations. So we have agent-based systems, differential equations. We should move on. Here's an example of a well-known continuous system. This is the Lorentz Equations. This showed up. This is where actually complexity theory really got started. And this is, thanks Brad for this video, but very quickly, I'm really taking too much time, what you see is two points that started very close together, and you see they're no longer very close together. See that even though they're following a well-known thing, so if I had a little bit of mistakes in the measurements of how they got started, and in fact, what I'm going to show you in the next chart with any luck, is here's an example of a scattergram of where these endpoints of having run after 25 seconds in time, where these things ended up. And in the case on the right, we had a standard error of 0.05, and on the one on the left, I had a standard error of 0.00000005. And you see the endpoints are still all over the map. So what we have here is Conway's world with an epidemic. And the yellow nodes, this is sort of like how a very simplistic model of how the biome could work, for example. And what happens here is there's a 50% chance that if you're infected, if your neighbor is infected, then you'll get infected. Other than that, these had exactly the same initial conditions. Okay, the only change is that whether people got infected or not, and you see the outcome after 99 iterations is entirely different. Okay, so if you were an epidemiologist and you said, I know exactly where everybody is, I know the chance of everybody getting infected, how many people are going to be alive at the end of some period of time? The answer is I don't know. And there's no way of knowing. Okay.
Which makes it so important to capture things early.
That's right. Yeah. And so we need more information. This is a histogram. I know that it's a little bit of math, but what this is if you look at the bottom, there's the number of people, number of things that are alive at the end of 100 seconds. And you see that there is a peak, and there's a shape to this distribution, and it goes all the way from 0 to 200, but there are we can make some reasonable guesses based on the shape of the distribution, and that's the key point here. And I'm going to hand it over to Brad, but in all cases where we have uncertainty and where we have complexity, it's not that we can't predict things. We can't predict things for certain, but we can predict things statistically.
Yes.
And if we can predict things well enough to understand the odds and apply it to these kinds of systems, this is how betting systems works. These are all the smart quants in the business who are Wall Street. And we want to apply this to a whole wider broad of things.
So this mathematics, in your opinion, what's the adjective you would use to describe its applicability? How broadly applicable is it?
But it's applicable to everything.
Well, that's broad.
Yeah.
Okay.
Other than that, no, seriously.
Yeah.
Even if you actually look at quantum mechanics and look at the Schrodinger wave equation,
Yeah.
it's actually the same kind of math. It just applied to the wave functions.
Well, that would be everything.
That would be everything.
Yeah,
You know,
okay.
seriously, it's everything.
All right. Well,
Okay.
I think I'll coach
And
on that
anything
one.
that changes in time, these are the fundamental laws that apply. And we've
Yeah.
learned this over the last 50 years. Now, there's still other things to be known, and Brad's going to show you more about the structures of all these things.
Yeah.
And so particularly the effect of evolution and kinds of systems we get from evolution
Yeah.
in the fractals. So we have a problem in the community, which is this isn't simple math.
Mm-hmm.
We can make simple visualizations, it's really cool.
Yeah.
But understanding that the key thought is that there really is a dynamical system, whether it be agent-based or we approximate it with a continuous one. And understand that we'll never have perfect information.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't have a clockwork,
But we can do the work.
but we can do the work
Yeah.
and we can make something important happen.
Yeah. And it's all showing us flow and interaction.
In interaction, right.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about interaction, real quickly, is that you would think that coupling would make things more complicated, and the answer is not always.
Not always. Yeah.
Because my favorite example is a what's a ketchup bottle. Because the viscosity is because the different molecules are interacting with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And by decoupling them, I can make the flow much more complicated.
Mm-hmm. True.
So there you go.
All right.
Okay.
Brad, before we jump in with a little bit deeper into this, do we have the George Sugihara film? Yes or no?
I don't think.
Oh, no.
We didn't.
We showed the Lorentz Butterfly.
Do we have that? Can we show it?
So that was the.
Here it is. So what you're seeing here is the attractor in 3 dimensions.
Oh, yeah, okay, cool.
And it's a very smooth flow, as you can see. And there's the equation that we've been talking about on the upper right.
Yeah.
And
I was in graduate school when this was first discovered.
what you're going to see, they're not running a soundtrack, so I'll be the soundtrack, is they take the Cartesian coordinates in 3 dimensions and they separate them to project them into 3 different graphs. And you'll see those graphs drawn any minute now.
And so this looks fairly regular, but if you actually try to predict where this point is going to be based on its initial condition, in fact, you can't do that.
Right.
So this is where uncertainty can result from deterministic systems.
So
And
here
that's our life.
we're projecting onto the x-axis, calling that time.
Oh, look at that. That's nice.
And then we're going to project onto not just x, but all 3.
Right.
When I watch this happen, I often think of flow and interaction as though you had an old-fashioned paddleboard with a rubber band and a ball, and it goes out so far, and then the tension on the rubber band brings it back.
Very
it
simple
feels like
coupled
those.
system. Yeah.
Yeah, it feels like those interactions, those constraints are exactly happening here.
Yeah. And
So we have 3 colors, 3 projections. The point I think is interesting here is if you just saw one of these charts, you'd probably think it's kind of meaningless. There's a little bit of a regularity to it, but what's the information in there? You wouldn't really know. You'd probably think it's random, or if not random, at least chaotic. And yet, what they're showing you now is that you could recreate the attractor, the smooth thing, by adding these 3 together again in dimensions. So that's the proof of case that this is real. So from a very, very smooth core function, you get these very, very not smooth x, y, and z projections. And I'm just suggesting that if we lived in a world where we only saw x, y, or z, we wouldn't know that behind that there was a source of flow that was very simple.
so there's 2 key things. So take the biome, for example. You look at all these things moving around in the biome, but there's some sort of underlying physics of how these things are interacting.
Right.
And we're going to start having to model those things.
Yes,
Right.
exactly right.
And the other point, which is that all these systems, taking a one measurement at one point in time doesn't tell you very much
No.
about how this system is working.
You'd get almost nothing out of it.
You're right, but tell that to your doctor.
Yeah, I know.
Okay.
That's right. All right, Brad, here we go. So the deep dive, I'm just going to let you run. Let's go ahead.
So this is complicated.
Yeah.
It's not complex.
Okay.
And the difference is complicated is deterministic and predictable. And complex is often deterministic, but not predictable. And I'll go into that in a little bit. But first I wanted to show some images of real things that have properties that look mathematical and look self-similar and have the characteristics that are described as fractals. And there's a fern in my backyard, and there's a mathematical version of my fern. And fractals are basically systems that are self-similar and follow a common set of rules. And as you vary the rules, you vary what you get, and a very small change makes a very big difference. And we get lots of different types of trees from very common rules about trees. And then even such things as charring and how the oxygen goes through a burn goes into fractal type relationships. Now, just because things are complex doesn't mean they're complicated. This is a very simple two-pendulum system, just two simple formulas that are coupled, and to predict the path of the second pendulum is basically impossible unless even if we knew the entire, we would never be able to get the same starting point. And so even though it's deterministic by those formulas, we wouldn't be able to get there.
Right.
This next video is from my kitchen table. I like to play with magnets. And I built this just to get a better understanding of energy flows through the system and coupling and resonance in the system to see how a very, very simple pendulum system ends up with very, very complex flows. Now, we talked a little bit about fractals, and for anybody who've never heard of it before, this is the Mandelbrot set. The Mandelbrot set is a very simple equation that only has 7 characters in it, and ends up with immense complexity. And you mentioned we're going to do a dive into it. You saw the dive at the beginning. Well, we're going to zoom in by a factor of 10 to the 40th power. And
10 to the 40th.
10 to the 40th power. And each of these 5 images is the same thing. We're just looking at it through different types of visualizations. The one in the middle, we're alternating odd and even bands with black and white. But depending on how you describe this or how you map it, you get to see and highlight different characteristics of it. So the reason I want to bring this up is talk about the sensitivity to the initial conditions. So these are the 40-digit coordinates of that particular point. What happens if we just change the last digit of that by 1? And what we get is completely different set. Each one of those images is entirely different, and there's no way to tell in advance what that's going to look like. And if you want to see what it looks like in color, that is the same as, whoops, so that and that are identical. It's just looking at them through different viewpoints. Now, you can see in these pictures that there are patterns there. If we go back to the black and white, you can see those really dense gray areas are areas of high unpredictability, or where the change and sensitivity to the initial conditions is greater. And so there are high density and low density, and we'll get back to this. And again, this is what I call a Seussian diagram of that same fractal in looking in a different place. And if you stare at it long enough, you'll see the caterpillar with legs flowing down into pools. But the point is, those broad band areas are areas of low rate of change, and the high density areas are the structures that have high rate of change and high sensitivity. And there is a lot of structure in there. You can see that here we're zooming in by 2 to the factor of 1800, 2 to the factor of 3600. If we double that, in power to 2 to the 7,200. That's the deepest I've ever died. It is almost identical to the 2 to the 3,600 power. The point is there's structure there, but unless I know how to look, I have to develop an intuition for this. And the net result of this very small formula is we get our snail, the spiral of the snail. We can get something like a fingerprint, or dance steps, or coupled springs, or a broken glass, or the sun, or a mesh network, or a paramecium, or mitosis, or a cell wall, or for that matter, even a hyperbolic curve, or a set of sine waves. These are all that same formula, just looking at different locations, at different magnifications with different visualizations. And it is incredibly compact. And it's that compactness that gets us back to the biology. And if we think about the seed that I have highlighted there, it's the differences in genetic code between 3 different oaks are minute, but they have fundamentally very, very different, outcomes. Now, that's all great and a lot of fun, and I really enjoyed. This is a hobby. Murray's the mathematician. I just sort of play with this stuff, but there's a big so what here. And I want to get back to when you first started talking about flows and resistance. And I had a lot of problem with flows and resistance. But flows and interactions really makes it happen, because if you look at flows and the movement, if we look at system dynamic models that we have of understanding of things, what's missing in those pictures is the independent interaction of independent actors or agents, and the effects of small changes of initial conditions, and for that matter, small changes of conditions that we face. I mean, if you and I are identical and we walk into the room, you're to the left of me by a little bit, that's enough to trigger a tremendous change in perspective. You might not be able to see the same thing that I can see. So the move to flow and interaction allows the encompassing of agents into that conversation, and she completely changes the picture.
Yeah.
So if I could add to that, I think it was Larry yesterday who mentioned it, that one of the ways to understand why people with identical genetics can have different traits, characteristics, is because of epigenetics. And epigenetics says that your genetics, you have how the genetics expresses itself is how it interacts with, is informed by the experiences you've had, and it might even go into the womb. And so, so even as something that seems as deterministic as genetics is in fact a coupled dynamic system.
Absolutely. I think that's all true for almost all biological processes. They're so tightly connected.
Yes.
And all of this gets back to uncertainty and understanding uncertainty. And just because there's a deterministic function here, that is, if we repeat it with the exact same parameters, we get the exact same results. The problem is we can't repeat it with the exact same parameters. Just because there is uncertainty doesn't mean there isn't structure. And the more compactness there is, the more structure you can discertain, and so that you can learn and develop an intuition. And I love the statement that was made earlier about seeing to understand and to develop the intuition. We can develop an intuition to steer clear the areas of extra instability and extra sensitivity.
Yeah. I've often thought that what you just mentioned earlier, Brad, about not just evolution, but how both the online genetic development of one individual, but also the question of how life works. We don't really understand that, and so we made a big mistake up until recently, thinking that it was one gene, one protein, and the math didn't work. It turned out we started doing genomes like, we're off by a big factor here. So not only do we not even now understand how we do the most basic things like make proteins, but there's this big issue called junk DNA. There's this big issue I think, of building an animal of any type or a plant of any type. The variety you were mentioning from such a small, the unfolding from one cell to that thing has to have a very, very compact instruction set, which is wildly robust. So much more robust than we are used to thinking about.
So there's an interesting article, I think it was last week in Technology Review, about why fractals tell us so much about the universe and why we can, with so many possible formulas for the way things are, it's the nature of the structure of the universe is designed with an ultimate level of compactness. And I think that, and perhaps you can back me
We're out
up
of time
on
here.
this.
But
I would, but we're out of time.
But there are only 22 parameters that physically describe our universe.
And so when yesterday I was trying to say we're moving from a proxy language to a language which is actually the thing itself. That's what we just talked about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.